Support for this podcast comes from the Central Valley Journalism Collaborative, connecting communities with the resources, infrastructure, and networks to ensure a vibrant local free press.
From KVPR in Fresno, this is Central Valley Daily. It's Monday, March 30th. I'm Elizabeth Arkalian. What do you know about Bakersfield's civil rights history?
There's not a lot of archives that you can go to find the history of racial segregation in Bakersfield in the first half of the 20th century.
Today, we revisit our conversation with an author and professor who discusses what he uncovered. We'll have that conversation in just a moment.
Central Valley Daily listeners like to know what's going on in their community. And coming up this spring is our Corks and Brews event. On Sunday, May 3rd, we'll have nearly 40 different wineries and breweries waiting to pour you a drink. Come put a face to the names of the people behind this podcast. We'll also have live music, a silent auction, and food trucks. Tickets are $75. Get yours today at kvpr.org.
And now to our feature story. When you think about the fight for civil rights here in the Central Valley, you might think of the Delano grape strike and the birth of the United Farm Workers movement, both of which have been in the news over the last few weeks. While that is a pivotal part of the Valley's history, a local professor's book explores the history of civil rights with a lens on Bakersfield outside of the farm labor movement. Dr. Oliver Rosales is a history professor at Bakersfield College. He's the author of the book Civil Rights in Bakersfield: Segregation and Multiracial Activism in the Central Valley. And today we're revisiting our conversation with Rosales from late 2024. He discussed with me the challenges of documenting these lesser-known sides of Bakersfield.
There's not a lot of sources, there's not a lot of archives that you can go to find the history of racial segregation in Bakersfield in the first half of the 20th century. I'm very grateful to the folks at the Historical Research Center at Cal State Bakersfield who are doing a really tremendous job trying to pull together sources to document the history of restrictive covenants in Bakersfield. You know, if you were to Google, redlining in American cities, you can find in Fresno, for example, the redlining maps that were produced by the federal government. Bakersfield didn't have the population threshold, in part because of the way that city boundary lines were drawn to exclude certain people. But you can't go Google, Bakersfield redlining and see that FHA map. However, the Historical Research Center and some folks who are consulting with the project have gone in and started to look at the housing deeds and particularly restricted tracts and starting to map it. So I was able to include a little bit of that into a precursor chapter, as well as just trying to narrate, again, the history of mostly Black and brown settlement in the first half of the 20th century.
In your book, you talk about it being a little too narrow to just look at civil rights progress in the Central Valley solely through the lens of the farm worker labor movement. Can you expand on that a bit?
Yeah, the farm worker movement was a catalyst. I think that's generally how I characterize it, but I'm also trying to push beyond the Delano grape strike in 1965. I'm trying to go back 20, 30 years before 1965 to look at mostly the failed farm labor strikes of the 30s and 40s, but how they were a galvanizing force for urban civil rights reform. So if you had failed strikes in the fields, reformers, activists, organizers started to then concentrate on other things like sidewalks or streetlights or fighting poverty, getting people to vote, getting them registered, because they recognized that the process of social justice was a long haul and that you had to do some of that sort of community organizing. So I look at that all pre-1965 and then take the story forward into how the Delano grape strike accelerated, changed, built racial coalitions, not only in the fields, but also in the urban centers. So again, it's really a post-World War II civil rights coalition history, I think, at its core. And there's a lot of scholars across the United States who are doing coalition studies in American civil rights history. And really, that's the story out west. Comparative to, say, for example, civil rights studies in the South or the North, the story of the West, I think, ultimately is about racial coalitions.
That's really interesting. I spoke to a faculty member at UC Merced at one point who was educated in the South and was saying how when she came out here to UC Merced, she worked in the sociology department. She really had to adapt. It's very black and white in terms of thinking of racial justice in the South. And she had said the complexity of like the experience in California and out West was so different. She really had to adapt her teaching to all of the different groups out here in our region.
One thing I will say, though, that's interesting about the South is that there are strong connections between Southern history and California history, particularly in the Central Valley. So, for example, the National Farm Labor Union, which was a sort of failed union in the 1940s that tried to strike in DeGiorgio, that's not as well known as the Delano grape strike, but it was very critical. It went on for like 18 months or something like this. That union was an offshoot of the Southern Tenant Farmers Union in Alabama, right? A lot of the organizers who were sort of blacklisted and targeted in the South, they came out West to organize. Another example with the United Farm Workers, Marshall Gans, who is from Bakersfield. He's at Harvard now as a lecturer in the Public Policy Institute, organizer for Obama's '08 campaign. He went to Harvard, sort of dropped out and went to the South to organize, Mississippi voters in 1964, came back to Bakersfield and with his own words said he saw Bakersfield now with Mississippi eyes. And he had been blinded to the struggle in the fields. And it took him to go to Mississippi to kind of come back and say, what's going on in the rural peripheries in my hometown? So there's all these really interesting connections between the South. And I explore some of that in my book, including with the fair media movement, where local Mexican-American and Chicano activists were fighting for fair media representation in Bakersfield and building connections with Mississippi attorneys and folks who had fought the Jim Crow media system in Mississippi, using the same kind of legal arguments, but then applying it to Mexican-American communities. So again, there are these interesting connections between the South and California.
Sure, and that these well-known things like the Delano grape strike, they're not operating in a vacuum.
Oh, no, the folks in Mississippi were paying attention to what was happening in Delano. I mean, and there was correspondence between, King and Caesar, as well as other organizers. I mean, there were Latinos in the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. There were Latinos in the South. So they were certainly paying attention to what was happening in Delano, no doubt.
You write that the region is understudied, the southern San Joaquin Valley and probably the Central Valley in general. What more could be done to better illustrate our region's history?
So there's a few things. I think on the one hand, part of it is archives building. My most exciting archive stories associated with this book was uncovering the Civic Unity newsletters. And so the Civic Unity, the Kern Coalition for Civic Unity, I think is really the organizational hero of the book because it brought together all these multiracial coalition activists and groups and people into a single unified movement. And I discovered through my research process after doing oral history is that they had a newsletter that was published for 20 years. And, I didn't find that in an archive. It wasn't in the library. It was buried in somebody's garage. And so after the book was finished, I made sure that got deposited over in the archives at Cal State Bakersfield. But archives building is, I think, our number one priority that we have to have as educators, as a community, so you can access this history. If you want to research the history of the San Joaquin Valley, I had to go to Detroit, to the Wayne State University. I had to go to the Beinecke Library at Yale, to Stanford. We need archives at home too. I think that's huge. And digitization can help, but that's huge infrastructure building. So that's one hand. I think on the other hand is the teaching part of it. So a lot of my work, aside from scholarship, is focused on place-based pedagogy, culturally responsive teaching, equity teaching, and making sure that the local is embedded into the K through 16 curriculum. And that's a struggle because there's not a lot of professional development in the area. It takes a lot of grant writing. And it takes capacity. And so, those two things, archives building and making sure that teachers are able to adequately teach content related to local history, local culture is, I think, two of the most important things that we can do as a community of educators and civic folks who care. And of course, again, the book itself. I mean, I'm so proud that this book is out because it can be assigned. It can be assigned in classrooms. It can be taught. It can be studied. It can be, what I hope is it's a catalyst for future scholarship. So, for example, I have a chapter on the Chicano movement at Bakersfield College, but there really needs to be a follow-up study on the Chicano youth movement throughout the Valley. I mean, so many schools, high schools, built murals on campus. They had active Mecha clubs. They were involved in civic life. But again, I think I'm really just kind of scratching the surface and hopefully opening up a portal or a window for then younger people to say, oh yeah, I could pursue this research topic. It's okay to research the Valley. I'm jealous of, Southern California and UCLA and USC that produces all these people who study Southern California, but it doesn't seem to go north of Santa Clarita. So I think we can do something similar, with the Central Valley.
Speaking of education and curriculum, in your book, you spend some chapters focusing on lesser-known people who made an impact on civil rights in Bakersfield, one of them being Jesus or Jess Nieto. He helped establish Chicano Studies curriculum at Bakersfield College, where you are. You wrote that in 1973, quote, a substantial position of both the faculty and the conservative community were outraged at the idea of incorporating an ethnic studies requirement into curriculum. So how did he overcome that pushback, and were there other challenges? I mean, things have changed pretty dramatically since 1973, right?
Yeah, in revising that chapter, I just kept hearing echoes of the present because, in California today, you have the ethnic studies requirement at the CSU, it's at the community college now, it's at the high school, but ethnic studies as a field really is 4 principal disciplines. It's Chicano studies, African American studies, Native American studies, and Asian American studies. And so the origins really of Chicano studies is the kind of roots of ethnic studies in the Valley. And, Jess was building a Chicano studies curriculum and program before the university was around. The university didn't quite exist at that time. Bakersfield College had been around for 50 years prior. I think what made it possible for him to do that system change was 2 things. It was the students. So the students were totally mobilized, totally activated, and they were on the hiring committees. They were pressuring the admin, particularly, I think, using the boycott method. So they were seeing what was happening in the fields and how you do systemic change, and then applying that to higher education. So I don't think that you ever would have had, a Jess Nieto being able to build that curriculum if you didn't have those engaged students. And then on the second hand, there were visionary administrators. John Collins, for example, the president of Bakersfield College in the early 70s, he was an avid supporter of Chicano studies. I think he saw the future. So I think it was a certain level of circumstance that led for him to do that. And he also had mentors. One of my other chapters is on Ray Gonzalez, who was the first Latino elected to the California Assembly from the Central Valley. I think he was the only member of the Assembly at that time who had a PhD. He was Jess's professor. He was Jess's mentor. But he left academia to go into politics, and he only served 1 term. But his grassroots campaign that led him to the Assembly is what I recount, because he beat an incumbent. Mexicans were not a majority at that time in the voting population. So he had to build all these coalitions to get him to office. And so, so as I said, Jess had mentors. And so those 2 individuals, Jess and Ray, who have passed on, I wish they had lived this long to see the book, but they knew it was coming. And I felt good that they, knew it was coming and had a chance to do interviews with them. And I've given copies of the book to their family members, but they're also heroes in the book. But it wasn't just about Chicano civil rights. Everything that they did was coalitions, building across, in Jess's case, transnational lines, working with Mexican immigrant communities. In Ray's case, working with women's groups, working with African-American groups. I mean, they were total coalition builders. And so I hope that my book, pushes the boundaries of understandings of Chicano studies and Chicano civil rights, is that it doesn't exist in a vacuum, that it occurs successfully often in concert with other coalition groups.
That was my conversation with Bakersfield College history professor Dr. Oliver Rosales. He's the author of the book Civil Rights in Bakersfield, Segregation and Multiracial Activism in the Central Valley. And that does it for today's show. Today's episode was produced by Jonathan Linden and KVPR with support from the Central Valley Journalism Collaborative. I'm Elizabeth Arkalian. Find the latest local news anytime at kvpr.org.
This is Tanya Mosley, co-host of Fresh Air. You'll see your favorite actors, directors, and comedians on late-night TV shows or YouTube. But what you get with Fresh Air is a deep dive. Spend some quality time with people like Billie Eilish, Questlove, Ariana Grande, Stephen Colbert, and so many more. We ask questions you won't hear asked anywhere else. Listen to the Fresh Air podcast from NPR and WHYY.